Well, good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning, and welcome back to Morning Musings here on Now TV. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. I just have to say how much I appreciate hearing from a growing number of you who've been watching the program, and we continue to examine, the challenge of Christ. John chapter 10, verse 37. If I do not do the works which the Father has given me, do not believe me, said Jesus. Now, I've shared with you just recently how, I can't help but laugh, and it's not truly funny. It's actually tremendously sad. I've had this gentleman, well, gentleman's a very kind word, but nonetheless, he cites John chapter 17 and verse 4, in which Jesus immediately before his passion is offering the priestly prayer up to the Father. And Jesus said, Father, glorify me now with the glory that I had with you before the world began. I have done, or I have finished the works that you have given me to do. And so this individual swears up and down that means that everything the Father had given Jesus to do up to that point. Well, actually, no, he's saying, you'll have to excuse me for being facetious here. He is saying that Jesus had already done everything that the Father had given him to do. Now, folks, there could not be a greater example of what I call an atomistic and simplistic approach to Scripture. Let me illustrate that. Again, I've shared this with you, but it is extremely important that you understand how ridiculous some people can be in their argumentation. It's kind of like I very often say, argumentum ad desperatum. Well, this is a classic example of that. And here's what I mean. Hebrews chapter 2, verse 10 to 14 tells us Christ was manifested to destroy him that had the power of death, that is, the devil. Okay, so Christ was manifested to do something. Now that's in the subjunctive, which means that it was the intent for him to do that. To do what? To destroy him who had the power of death, that is, the devil. Okay, so the Father gave Jesus the mission. It was the Father's will in sending Jesus to destroy the devil. Now remember, this individual is arguing that in John chapter 17, verse 4, Jesus had already done what the Father gave him to do, everything the Father gave him to do. So since Jesus in John chapter 17, verse 4, said, I have finished the work which you've given me to do. I've done everything that you've given me to do. And that means that Jesus had already done what the Father gave him to do. That should mean that he had already destroyed the devil. Oh, but wait. Jesus hadn't died yet, had he? But Hebrews tells us that it was to be through his death, that he would destroy him who had the power of death, that is the devil. Had Jesus died yet in John chapter 17? Well, no. Well, since his death was for the purpose of destroying the devil, since he had not died yet, he had not yet destroyed the devil. Sorry if this sounds repetitious. Therefore, since he had not died, since he had not destroyed the devil, he had not yet done everything the Father gave him to do. Now, folks, I'm sorry, that's just as simple as that could be. And yet, when I pointed this out to this individual, he said, you refuse to answer my question. All you do is ask questions in response. Well, very often Jesus in his ministry, when the Pharisees and Sadducees, pardon me, would approach him, they'd ask him a question. And in response, in order to refute them and in order to show how absurd, argumentum ad absurdum, their questions were, he would pose another question. So, I'm on pretty good grounds by teaching through asking questions. I'm on pretty good grounds by showing that when a person is arguing position A on a given text, by asking if what is related to issue A and text A, if that has been fulfilled and the answer is no, then the claim being made about position A is therefore false. So in this case, when this individual says, see, Jesus said he had already done everything the Father gave him to do. Preston therefore is wrong when he says that Jesus had to come again in order to fulfill everything the Father had given him. Well, all we have to do, number one, is ask, was Jesus' parousia, the second coming, the judgment, the resurrection, are all of those things that the Father had committed to Jesus to do? Well, according to Jesus in John chapter 5, 21 and following, pardon me, from henceforth the Father judges no one, but has committed all judgment to the Son, that all men might honor the Son as they do the Father. The Son can do nothing of himself, but what he sees the Father do, he will do likewise. And so, here's what this means. The Father had given the prerogative of judgment to the Son so that the Son would judge. Had Jesus judged the world in John chapter 17, verse 4? When he said, I finished the work you've given me to do? Well, obviously, that's ridiculous. Argumentum ad absurdum. And so, again, it just shows how ridiculous some people can be in order to find any fault whatsoever with the truth of covenant eschatology. But it can't be done. I certainly don't have all the answers, never have claimed to have all the answers, but you know what? When some people make arguments that are that ridiculous, that atomistic, that ill-informed, that unstudied, then it's easy to have the answers for those. So we continue our study. Too much coffee lately, folks. Sorry about that. We continue our study of the Kairos, the appointed time. The appointed time for what? The appointed time for the judgment, the coming of the Lord, and the resurrection. I have shared with you over and over again over the last couple of years how the Old Testament writers foretold the last days. The New Testament writers said the last days had arrived. The Old Testament writers foretold the coming of the Kairos, the appointed time of the end of the age. Daniel chapter 12 and verse 4. The Kairos to Eskatu, the appointed time of the end. And the New Testament writers, Jesus included, said the appointed time had come. And I have to tell you this. This program will air before the event takes place, so I'll go ahead and take note of it. I am due on April the 12th, 2023, to have a formal internet debate with a fellow by the name of Mark Smith. Now, Mr. Smith, identifies and defines himself as a former member of the Churches of Christ, which is also my background, of course, and a longtime minister in that church, in that fellowship. But he said his journey out of Christianity began in class one Sunday morning when the teacher was going through Matthew chapter 24, and they were reading about the coming of the Lord on the clouds with power, great glory of the angels, and a shout and the sound of the trump to gather the elect. And verse 34, all these things shall take place in this generation. And he said, he raised his hand and said, well, teacher, Jesus said it was going to take place in his generation. How do we explain that? Because he clearly didn't come. And he said, the teacher said, well, let me study that just a little bit and get back to you. And of course, he somewhat proudly says, the teacher never said another word about it. And so Mr. Smith, like so many other atheists, like so many other skeptics, so many other agnostics, they tell us, see, people recognize the fact that Jesus said he was coming back in the first century on the clouds to put an end to time and space and all of this kind of stuff. He very clearly did not do it. Therefore, we have to trash the Bible, give up our faith in Jesus Christ. Now, Mr. Smith wrote a book entitled Broken Promises. You have to understand that Mr. Smith's entire premise in the book is that Jesus said he was coming back, as a 5'5" Jewish man, riding on literal cumulus clouds out of heaven with literal angels and a literal shout and a literal trumpet, etc., all the bodies of all the dead who've ever lived, who've gone into the ground, gone into the sea, shall be raised up out of that, given new bodies, and everybody goes to heaven. That was Mr. Smith's belief. Everything's literal, physical. Well, once again, obviously it didn't happen. His entire book is based upon the premise of the literal expectation of a physical coming of Christ. Well, based upon that false foundation, then he's right. Jesus didn't come. Well, here's the irony. When I knew about the book, I challenged him to a debate. You know what the ironic thing is? Mr. Smith refuses to debate the premises of his book. He says, I will not debate my book. Isn't that weird? Isn't that strange? And is that not more than a little revealing? You write a whole book, big book, but you won't defend it. Instead, you want to argue the proposition that reads, preterism fails. Now look, folks, as someone who's been involved in the polemic world for an awful long time, that's an absolutely horrible proposition. It's not well defined. It's not defined at all, except the word fail, but it doesn't tell you anything else. But that's the only proposition that Mr. Smith would affirm. Now, I believe I know what Mr. Smith is going to try to do. Obviously, he doesn't want to argue about what the Bible says. The only the only alternative that he has, therefore, is to argue that the Bible is not valid. It's not historical. It's not inspired. That's the only thing that he has left to argue. And there are any number of approaches that he can take to that, all of which is fine with me that he do. Let's just see if he can confirm what he has set out to do, and that is to destroy the validity of the Bible. Now, I say all of that to remind us of how serious the challenge of Christ is. Christian after Christian after Christian is not even aware of the fact that Jesus said he was coming back in the first century. Or they just blithely wave their hand at it and say, oh, well, God doesn't talk in time like we do. God doesn't think in time like we do. Well, listen, let me tell you something. If you were going to go into a foreign country and you wanted to communicate a truth to them, wouldn't you use their language? Wouldn't you use language that they understood and could fathom and comprehend? Well, of course you would. It would be ridiculous to do otherwise. You wouldn't try to communicate in nonsense, which reminds me of back in the 30s, Amy Semple McPherson, a charismatic preacher, was teaching in tongues, supposedly. And there was a tremendous revival. This is an illustration of what I'm talking about, ladies and gentlemen. And all of a sudden, they set up schools to go into all the world to preach the gospel to every creature, they said. And to speak in tongues. You know what happened? Nobody tried to learn the languages of the nations of and people to whom they were going to go and to preach. So they went and they gathered up these great big revivals, and they would get up and they would, quote, speak in tongues, unquote. Trouble of it is, nobody could understand a single, quote, word, unquote, that they said. They were talking in absolute gibberish. And they were utter failures. Which proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that gift of tongues that they claimed to possess, they claimed to possess the gift of tongues of the languages of the people that they were going to convert. And those people couldn't understand because one word they said, because they weren't speaking in words. They weren't speaking in language. And so when people say, well, you know what? God doesn't think in time like we do. God doesn't communicate time like we do. That means that God went into a country, earth, time, space, tried to communicate with man, but since his concept of time is so foreign to us, so unknown to us, so so incomprehensible to us, that we don't really understand a word he said. Now, we can understand what he says when he says he loves us. We can understand what he says when he says that his son died for us. We can understand what he said when he said he was going to establish his church. We can understand all of that, you see. We just can't understand time, how God speaks in time. How is it that God can make himself known in all of these other expressions, in all of these other verbs and nouns and pronouns and all of these other aspects of the human language, but the only aspect of the human language that God just can't seem to get it down to communicate truthfully is time. And therefore, when Jesus said the time is fulfilled, the kingdom of heaven is at hand, we just don't know what he meant by that. Or when he said, behold, I come quickly, my reward is with me, Revelation 22:12. We just don't know what that could possibly mean. Do you see how absurd that is? But I must continue, and I've got to hurry. Goodness gracious, time has gotten away from me this morning. But be looking for my debate, with Mr. Mark Smith. It will be on Myth Vision blog on YouTube. I do not have the exact specific times for that. Even after the debate, it will be posted on the internet, of course, on YouTube. So be watching for that Mark Smith versus Don K. Preston debate. Now then, I shared with you how Daniel chapter 9, as we have discussed the appointed time, and this is what's so remarkable, ladies and gentlemen. All of those people who tell us that God cannot communicate in time, they're able to go to Daniel chapter 2, where Nebuchadnezzar saw a vision of four beasts, or of a beast with four elements to it, and that the fourth element, the feet of brass and iron and brass, or clay rather. And they can figure out, well, that's the fourth kingdom. That's the Roman Empire. Did God communicate truthfully about time? Of course he did. Those individuals, go to the Old Testament, Daniel chapter 7, 7 beasts. The four beasts that would arise. The fourth beast being Rome. And in the days of that fourth empire, the little horn would arise. The Ancient of Days would come, or the Son of Man would come as the Ancient of Days, destroy the little horn, receive the kingdom. The saints would possess the kingdom forever and ever. Days of the Roman Empire. Did God communicate well concerning the fourth empire? Yes, he did. Okay, since God could tell time well enough to communicate truthfully in regard to the four kingdoms, you know, this succession of four kingdoms, Babylonia, Medo Persian, Greece, Rome, God could understand that. God could communicate about that truthfully. And then we come to the New Testament, when in the days of that fourth empire, John the Baptizer said, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is drawn near. Jesus said, the time is fulfilled, the kingdom of heaven is drawn near. And all of a sudden, at just the right time, we don't know what God meant by time. We don't know what Jesus meant by the time is fulfilled, the kingdom of heaven is drawn near. Folks, it makes absolutely no sense whatsoever to say that God doesn't communicate in time truthfully. It just makes no sense whatsoever. Now then, so we come to Daniel chapter 9, 70 weeks are determined, cut out, katak in the Hebrew. I don't know if I pronounced that correctly. And that means in the stream of time, God cut out from here to here the period of time of the 70 weeks, and said within that 70 weeks, certain things were going to be accomplished. Now, the amazing thing about that is that the Jews of the first century understood, and they had calculated the time of the 70 weeks. They understood they were living in the days of the final countdown of Daniel chapter 9. It's really interesting that in John chapter 1, the Jews sent out an embassage to John and said, are you the one that we are looking for? Now, the word looking there is from prosdekomai, and it means an eager, expectant longing or looking for. In other words, they knew the time was right. They knew the appointed time was right. How did they know that? They could only know that by relying on the time statements of God found in Daniel chapter 9. It's the only way they could know that. And thus, once again, throughout the New Testament, we find the New Testament writers, here we find John, and then we find Jesus, and then we find the New Testament writers telling us over and over and over again that the time had arrived, that appointed time. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I want to suggest to you, it is absolutely inappropriate. There is absolutely no justification whatsoever for saying, well, yeah, the time was right. It's true. I posted an article on Matthew chapter 10, 22 and 23 on academia.edu. Let me invite you to go there, academia.edu. And it's a examination of that critical text. Jesus said he was going to send his apostles out to preach. They would be hated of all men. They would be persecuted. And he said, when they chase you from city to city, You will not have finished going through all the cities of Israel until the Son of Man has come. You see, this is one of those passages that has caused men like Albert Schweitzer to completely abandon faith, Rudolf Bultmann to abandon faith, men like Mark Smith to abandon faith. Now, isn't it remarkable that God was able to tell the time in Daniel 2, and that time was fulfilled? God was able, Daniel was able to accurately predict the countdown of time in Daniel 7, and that prediction came true. Is it not remarkable that Daniel 9 gave us a countdown of time, and that countdown of time was accurate in the first century? Yet we're supposed to believe that although God got all of those time statements correct, he got the time statements concerning the establishment of the kingdom, well, it was supposed to be established, but it was postponed. Or, yeah, the time was right, but it failed. You mean to tell me that God was that poor at planning? Maybe it's a case of people having the wrong concept of the kingdom, the wrong concept of the parousia. And that's exactly what happens, ladies and gentlemen, in cases of people expecting a literalistic, nationalistic restoration of Israel with Jesus on a physical throne, and or the expectation that Jesus was ever going to come out of heaven riding on literal clouds with angels, the sound of a literal audible trumpet and shout. That is not what Jesus was predicting. That is not what Daniel chapter 9 is all about. That is not what the appointed time of the end is all about. Peter knew about the countdown of old, and he said, the appointed time has come for the judgment to begin. All these other time statements were correct. This one was not? No. I'm completely out of time. I'll see you next week.